from their encounters with races from other planets. The information is the activation. Let's awaken this world together. We are the forever students, and we will not be silent. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. It's pretty wild. Ooh, welcome everybody to Full Spectrum Universe. My name is Rob Yox. We are the Embattled Broadcast from the great state of New York, looking at our past, our present, to make the changes that we want to see in the future. Hello, hello, hello. Tonight is a special night. We're kind of getting back to our roots and what this show was started about. We're doing a little bit of a dive into the history, but I want to make an announcement before we get into that. And every show goes through a process, right? You're probably thinking to yourself, what's he talking about? But every show has a timeline in which they sort of redirect themselves, change themselves, sort of incorporate more of a broader universe or a broader understanding of things. And we've been diving into spirituality when we started really with ufology and history. And one of the things I want to do is I'm going to make an announcement tonight that this is a moment where the show is going to be sort of in like a redirection phase. Now, it's going to have all the same type of content we've just been doing, all the stuff that you love, but what I want to do is this is the starting of a new series tonight. This is like the prequel to a a new series in the lost knowledge of humanity that we talked about. And I've been kind of planning this for a little while. And what we're going to do is we're going to start to get into some of the historical points that really changed who we were as a society while going over it from a different perspective than normally just the history of it. We're going to go through it with the spirituality, with the essence of contact and extraterrestrials, and we're going to sort of dive into that arena. And one of the what I mean by all this is we're going to have like a culmination of all the different shows that we've done for almost 3 years now, and we're going to start doing a little bit more of those style of incorporating all of that information together. So sort of put it all together so we have a fuller, broader understanding. We're going to be adding some new topics, some political topics that may be a little bit, harder for people who are just in the spiritual community to just wrap their heads around because politics sometimes matters, sometimes it doesn't. But we're going to be taking the spiritual perspective of those political games that are being played. Politics is not really somewhere we really stay in, but if it's prevalent to the topics and what we're talking about, what we're trying to do is we're trying to incorporate all the knowledge we've learned up to now and put that into the shows. So we're also going to be making small little informational videos as well. We've been working on those all the time, but I want to start incorporating everything. We've been staying in that spiritual context and the energies and how the energies work, and we're still going to be doing that, but we're going to be adding more to it. We're going to be going back to these points in these civilizations, and we're going to be showing you, like tonight, we're going to be talking about the cross-cultural myths that essentially span across every ancient civilization that we can think of, or there's some trends, right? We're going to break that down. But I really want to get back to our roots in history with the myths as well, but also stay in that spiritual space where we're talking about spirituality at the same time. Also, when it comes to, ufology and contact, I want to stay in that spiritual mindset. So all of the work that we've done to this point is building, and we're building the spiritual understanding. So now when we go back into a lot of the stuff that we've somewhat talked about a little bit, we have a different perspective on it. And that's really what I want to do. And I think it's going to be something that we're all really going to enjoy because it'll give us a different understanding of the histories that were all around us, right? And some of this history is between 12,500 years from now. Some will give us, with the spiritual aspect of it, will give us stuff that predates that, which is going to be absolutely spectacular as well. Sort of like a combination of all of the spiritual things that we've talked about and galactic beginnings. And we're going to kind of go from there to kind of reinvent who we are. And this is something that shows do regularly. They reinvent themselves to sort of stay ahead of the trends and things that are happening and to stay relevant. And I think that it's time to incorporate all this information. And a big component of this also is Omar. And Omar, he talks a lot about what's happening right now and the symbolisms of that. And I think it's part of the reason why is I'm thinking to myself, maybe we can do like a, back then, now, all of it together. And I know Omar has a show with Augie this evening right after we finish here, which is going to be exceptional. And if you've been watching that, I mean, there's just a plethora of knowledge to be learned from that book. I've read it multiple times over, and Augie is explaining in great detail what was his motive for these chapters and what really was coming to him while he was writing it. So this is like almost like inside the Actors Guild with what's his face, James something. But it's inside of the cliff notes of the book by Augie Nost and Omar, right? So tonight is the grand unveiling of what this next step looks like a little bit and how we're going to kind of go into this lost knowledge of humanity. And I'm so excited for this. We're still, like I said, we're still going to be doing this spiritual stuff now and again. We're just going to be adding more into the pile of topics and subjects that the episodes are going to incorporate, which is really great. Some episodes now are going to feature two topics as opposed to just one. We're going to start somewhere, we're going to end somewhere else, right? It's part of this reinventing of the wheel, so to say. But I've got a presentation for you tonight. We've got a lot to go over. I'm glad everybody that's here. Please like, share, definitely subscribe. YouTube is hampering down on the subscriptions right now, and the promoting of this product and this community, which I think is a complete detriment to YouTube itself. But nevertheless, we're all here. I love you all. I see we've got Patrick here, Omar's here, Prince is here, Rockers is here. We've got Nancy here. I saw Stone Hobbit before. We've got Line. We've got the Andromedan. We've got everybody is here. So let's dive into what we're talking about tonight, which is the cross cultural myths, also known as comparative mythology. And one of the aspects of comparative mythology that we're going to be going over is timeline, right? How one entity is in all of these different cultures and surfaces through these stories, which gives us in definitive proof that there was contact, which is why this is a great place to start because it incorporates the spiritual beliefs of these people at the time. It includes ufology and contact. It also talks about specific stories that are inherent to, let's say, is it history or is it just a interpretation of what they tried to see? We can go into that avenue as well. So we're really going to be diving into a lot of different aspects of this. But again, this is like the prequel. So the cross culture myths and the specific topics that we see within these specific ancient cultures, that they all talk about the same thing, right? What does that tell us? That tells us that these either came from a common ancestral story and were broken down or given specific aspects where they differ because of cultural perspective, or or are all of these are all of these civilizations part of this great collective consciousness, and they're experiencing the same things because of this auric field that essentially resides out there, that is the collective so look at it. Well, it could be both. I think that there is a common ancestral story where these specific entities that traveled all over the world via gave their lineage to these groups, and these groups use their cultural perspectives to recreate these stories sort of pertaining to their people, right? They always talk about the gods, and in front of you, you see a tremendous collective of all of the different gods, and a lot of them are similar yet different, right? So, exactly, Prince says it. Yeah, same dudes, different names. Exactly, exactly. But how did they get this information? Is the question? Did it come from this ancestral book that predates modern civilization as we know it? Was it handed down to them orally through tradition, which a lot of it was? Or is there a collective consciousness, which is, again, a possibility, but it could be all of the above, not just one specific way, right? So this collective consciousness, just like when the light bulb was invented, we talk about the light bulb. The light bulb was invented in three different spaces or three different places on the planet around the same time because they're tapping into that Akashic collective consciousness. So this is what I mean by kind of taking these ancestral stories and giving it a spiritual context, but also using it to see ufology and connection to contact, also using it to explain these entities and how these entities resided in all of these different cultures spanning great distances, which is almost unexplainable. So this is sort of the direction we're going to be taking for the next couple of episodes to really dive into this. And if it starts to work out, we're going to try and keep in this direction because I think that this is something that really needs to be explored with our with our new understanding, our common understanding, but a newer perspective of spirituality and how it's all connected. And these cultures all sharing those same stories is the beginning of that it's all connected sort of mentality. So I think it's really great to go into these and really dive in and see what our perspectives are. So before we, what we're going to talk about is 11 specific myths that every culture seems to have. Now, they usually start with a creation story that is abnormally similar to each other. We're going to save that till the end. And then there's one right after that too. But we're going to dive in first to these specific myths. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as well before we get into it. And I'm going to, most of us grow up hearing stories or remnants of stories that date back to the earliest days of humanity. Some legends are specific to certain cultures, while other folklores have traveled far beyond the bounds of their original borders to become universally recognized. Think of Jack and the Beanstalk, Robin Hood, the Pied Piper to give you a little bit more of the modern tales as such, etc., right? So as we sit here and think of these stories at the time when we were children or when we were learning them as standalone stories that had that were delightful to listen to, magical, full of color, but not symbols of the general human like species and psyche, right? So we've come to realize just how interconnected such stories, not only with the people and the culture from which they are born, but also with similar stories from faraway communities and cultures, right? So when we move beyond the myths and the legends woven into our own culture and look at these specific stories from other cultural perspectives, you start to see a suggestion of something that appears to be linked. There is something between all of it that is kind of a common thread or connection, right? So the exact nature of this happening or something like this happening has never been conclusively agreed upon. There are many different thinkers with many different approaches and theories. Some be linguistics, some psychological, some even biological. There's an entire field of study called comparative mythology, dedicated to the comparison of myths from around the world, searching for this something. Some people go as far as to post ideas of one proto mythological being at the origin of all mythologies. So, from a comparative mythology standpoint, many shared themes, motifs, and characteristics have been found between these mythologies of various cultures. We can start with one common aspect of giants. For example, a very common appearance in folklore from all over the world is the giants. The Kumbhakarna from the Hindu mythology is a Rakashi, a supernatural being of gigantic size. The Horangara is a giant in the Norse mythology who was defeated in battle by the god Thor. Fionn Mac, or Cumhill, as the legend goes, is the giant from the Irish mythology responsible for building the Giant's Causeway on the Entrim coast, right? So It isn't just the staple characters and creatures like the giants, dragons, snakes that beg this connection of question, right? Certain stories seem to have very distinct parallels from across a wide range of cultures. One such story is the flood myth. And this is where we sort of pick up tonight, right? But we're going to keep going a little bit right now. But this is the first one we talk about because it is the most prevalent. The legend of a human building an ark in order to bring animals aboard, as well as biblical, is an Akkadian, Babylonian, Sumerian, and Hindi tale. Similar tellings of the Great Flood occur within a variety of cultures, including the Greeks, Egyptians, the Chinese, the Irish, the Welsh, the Finnish, the Polynesian, and of those, several Native American tribes as well. In the majority of cases, the flood is sent to a certain civilization by a deity as divine retribution. Another one we're going to be talking about tonight is the hero's journey, which is something we see in every sort of publication from the beginning of time. This is something that is still used in modern literature and media, and it dates back to the prehistoric times. Again, this structure can be found within the mythology of an array of unrelated cultures. The idea is believed to have been popularized by the comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell, with the journeying being roughly divided into three sections: departure, initiation, and return. It is a trope that is applicable to a character from Jesus to Buddha to Odysseus to Ocean, right? The link between mythologies becomes all more fascinating when you realize just how specific the similarities between some stories are. The tale of King Midas, for example. Midas is a king in both Greek and Roman mythology, part of the dynastic cycle. And as the legend goes, the god Apollo decided to charge Midas or ears into basically an act of revenge. And from then on, Midas hid his donkey ears underneath his turban away from the public view and made his barber promise not to reveal his secret, right? We all know about the Midas touch. So Midas is yet a king, some places referred to as gold, which is a superficial sort of story. And again, it goes into his ears in a different aspect, which could be related to that same superficial principle. So there's a lot, right? We can keep going. There's even a king by the name of Lawbry Longasearch in Irish mythology, and it's almost exactly the same as Midas. So this is something that we see very, very prevalent across all mythologies is this connection. And this connection is what we're going to be discussing in this specific style of series for the foreseeable future right now, but as we go forward, right? So, again, the first aspect of this is the flood. Yes, Almar says the hero's journey is known as the Transformer Brothers in Canadian Native stories. There is a Canadian culture called the Cree, which we're going to be diving into just very, very like lightly. But the Cree is an indigenous tribe relative to Canada, and they take part in a lot of these stories as well. They're one of the most R-rated stories to date from the Native Americans in Canada, from what we understand. That's right, Stone. This is part of the spiritual aspect of it, right? We're not just going to go into the stories, we're going to explore them by frequency, by spiritual components, right? You're absolutely right. Stoney says the hero's journey is the awareness of finding selves, higher frequencies, and unlocking one's own adventure, right? This is incredible. This is incredible. This is why we can all rally around this ancient these ancient mythological situations that are actually more prevalent today than we would actually understand, right? So the flood is seen as many, many different symbols, as a purge, as something that cleansed, humanity and its energies for a different sort of pivot later on past it. It's also seen as something that is absolutely destructive in nature, right? Because water is the most erosive style of um, against anything, right? It's most erosive against anything, whether it's rock, anything. So there's a lot to be said about this, but I want to go into a couple of the different flood myths because the flood myths is sort of like this rebuilding of humanity because the flood, the myth itself, while it's devastating, is usually followed by that. So the humans start over and build a new civilization to replace the old. We're seeing this more and more now with these events or these resets every 100 to 80 years, right? Except it's not a flood deemed by a deity. It's the powers that be sort of relaying this information or cyclically going through this information yet again, which is why this makes so much relativity to now, right? But the structure of life are put in order and re-erected with the good on top and the evil absent. This shows the resilience of the ancient peoples from around the world. And even though the human race is decimated by horrendous flooding, the survivors turn to their gods or gods once more for the strength, and the civilization repairs the problem that led to the first flood, at least for a while. And in this way, creation and flood myths are often interlinked and impossible to separate from each other. So there's two schools of thought surrounding the development of the flood myth, right? The first is based upon the notion of cultural diffusion. This concept entails one myth being passed around the world through trade and travel, with changes occurring to the corresponding with each culture's gods and beliefs. And the idea is commonly supported when dealing with the myths from the Middle East to the Mediterranean area. These myths are very similar when the names of the gods are taken away. However, the cultural diffusion theory falters when myths are discovered from areas that had no contact with the Middle East or any Mediterranean group. There is historical evidence that when the myths from these areas developed, certain groups were isolated, and yet these groups have flood myths that have similarities to most flood stories. The fact suggests to historians that the catastrophic flooding occurs in more parts of the world, and it was normal for people to write about any subject they knew and had witnessed, right? So we're going to go into a couple of these. This may be a two-parter for this specific breakdown because there's a lot to talk about, right? So the flood myths, right? In the ancient Babylonian text known as the Atoharis flood is an example of the flood myth. The gods have created man to do the work of the gods and goddesses, and they no longer wanted to do it. So the gods and goddesses, because they do not work, depend on mankind to ensure their food, drink, and through sacrifice their essence, right? So the population of humans grows and grows until they're so loud that they disturb the immortals, and the gods decide to rid the earth of humans. So to do so, they attempt plague, famine, and drought. And each time the human population explodes and stresses the earth. So Enki, um, the god of the deep, gives the humans advice each time that saves their race and stops the destruction. And finally, the gods are so angry with humans because of the damage to the earth, the disturbances of the gods, that they send a flood to destroy the population. And once again, Enki steps in and saves the human race by telling the Artreusis, a poise man, to build an ark and save himself. And later, after the humans are gone, the gods are hungry but have no source of food, so they start to sacrifice to the gods who eventually eat humankind, which is wild, right? So they're also in this way they're creating new immortals, and we can keep going on to mortality in Babylon and keys to this, but this basically resembles Genesis, right? Noah is faced with the same destruction of the human race. God thought that man was evil and had to be destroyed. Despite being sad about having to destroy what he made, God made his decision. And so the story goes. Noah created the ark, saved two of each animal, right? Humankind persevered. I mean, we can keep going. There's the Roman poet, Ovid, retells the flood myth in a metamorphosis. The tale of the Philemon and the Bacchius is the example of the destruction of humans, with two gods honoring people, a man and a woman, and surviving. The story takes place in Phrygia. I'm sorry, these names I never really get right. In Asia Minor. These two strangers were in Phrygia and had been turned away from many houses. It was the Middle East tradition to take in strangers and offer them a meal and shelter. This custom was, and is still today, followed throughout the Middle East area. And these two strangers continued in their search for shelter when they happened upon a home in the Philemon and Bacchius, or the home of Philemon and Bacchius. The elderly couple was poor and barely had enough money for themselves. However, they offered the strangers a full meal using all they had in the house. And the two strangers then revealed themselves as Jupiter and Mercury. The gods decreed that because of this inhospitable reception by those in the region, the area must be punished. And the entire area was flooded, barring the house of the Philemon and Bacchius, right? They were the only two that survived, which was they were spared, and the couples because of their goodness, right? And this changed into a temple and eventually the rebirth of mankind in that area. So, one more flood myth takes us to North America or Mesoamerica in the Aztec culture, which includes a destructive flood myth, but it has a twist on the survivors. So the Aztec believed that the earth was created in cycles, and each cycle was called a sun. So in the fourth sun, earth is flooded and mankind is changed into fish. So the exception are Tata and his wife, Nini, who are saved from the flood by hiding in a hollow tree. And when the floodwater recedes, Tata and Nini come out of their hiding and are hungry. They begin to cook the fish or the other humans and eat them. This so angers the gods that Tata and Nini are transformed into dogs, and their heads are switched into their rears. And after the flood, Tetzalcoatl and Quetzalcoatl, the gods who helped to destroy Earth during the four suns, began to rebuild the Earth. And then they created the heavens again and created man and woman. So there's also talk of the floods in India, right? So we're hitting on all points here. And as the flood myths, a male and a female are warned of imminent disaster. On the Indian myth, a woman goes to get water from the river. A fish warns her to take her brother and some pumpkin seed and a rooster and build a cage. And as the water begins to fall, the girl and her brother, with the seeds and the bird, climbed into the cage. When the floods covered the earth, the god Bhagwan, after being told by the rooster, realized that at least one human was alive. And Bhagwan found the girl and her brother and asked her who told her to hide. She replied the fish had warned her. This was called and lied at first, and eventually confessed that the warning would be punished, right? And the fish would have his tongue cut out. So the fish could no longer talk, and the leeches grew out of the tongues of the fish. So the girl and the boy were married and they began the human race and that existence all over again, right? So we see a lot going on with the myths here. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from this specific instance. And you see how I went into one specific myth. that was told all over the world, and we're already a half hour into this episode. So this is definitely going to be a two-parter, possibly more, just to keep going. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment when this is finished. Please help us boost this. This is something that we have to talk about because it's our ancestral knowledge, right? This is what we mean. And when we get in contact with the ancestors, sometimes these jumping off points or this information puts us into a different mindset to contact them. The spiritual realm is vast, and these stories have contact in those different dimensional densities. I promise you. I promise you. So, also, because of the flood myth, one more thing to add with the contact aspect, right? These entities were not on land. They were not here to be cast aside or destroyed by the flood, right? So we know that these entities had the means to come down, warn people, or punish people, or could potentially be the ones that started this by what the myths say, whether it's God, the gods, one or two, they seem to be the ones that initiate this flood. Or they could have initiated a polar or a pole shift, which in turn caused a great flood and an ice age. So there's a lot of different tactics we can use to sort of pull back the onion layers and look and see what they're trying to explain. And in later episodes, we're going to go into each of these different cultures, aspects, even individuals, and how their timelines work out and what their timelines mean. Tonight is just an overview, just so we can have some context into what and how important these stories are to modern day life, right? And how even the people who don't believe in spirituality or contact and ufology still believe in these stories. This is a bridge point, right? This is a point of interest that we can use to help wake people up because everybody believes these mainstream tales. But these mainstream tales are indicative of something else that comes before and after, right? There's more to it than just a story. So, number two, what if God was one of us? This isn't the song from the 90s. This is truly, what we talk about. And when we look at what if God was one of us, in Greek mythology, Zeus visits a king named Lycaon to check up on his hospitality skills. And Lycaon, who is not that great of a host, tries to have him killed in his sleep and then feeds him dead babies, right? This is crazy, right? Sounds terrible. But Zeus gets fed up, figuratively and literally, and turns Lycaon into the world's first werewolf. So this is one of the stories of the gods walking among us, right? The Norse basically had the same exact story. Odin shows up at a king's house to scope out hospitality, ends up tied up to a wall and getting alternately stabbed and set on fire for 8 solid days. And what does he do when he finally runs out of patience? He turns the king and everyone else in the house into, you guessed it, wolves, right? So this is where we see this bridging of story. And I bet you can find this story in ancient Japanese as well, ancient Chinese, Mesoamerican, Native American, African. There's a lot. There's a lot. So we're gonna kind of breeze over this one because this one is not as crazy as some would think it to be. This is a really wild one, but it's not that wild, right? If God was one of us, we hope. But there's times where even in the Bible, it talks about, right? So we can find commonality here, right? Between what we're talking about and all of the different cultures. And a lot of these themes show up in multiple cultures, if every last one of them, actually. So the next one is this is pretty gross, right? And I don't like talking about it, but it seems, and we're going to go through this one very quickly because, as you can see, we've got Game of Thrones up there. And if you know Game of Thrones, you know what that picture is, right? So I don't have to get into it. But there is a lot of incest in these stories. They used to believe in purifying the bloodline, and the noble houses used to marry their sisters for that specific purpose. We can see this throughout rifing through all of ancient mythology. The gods marry their sisters, their mothers. It's wild. It's wild that they, I don't even like talking about it. But so we're going to breeze through this really quickly. But the Greeks, the most famous example of this is Oedipus kills his dad, pretty much ends up with his mom, ends up stabbing his eyes out with knitting needles because, this is what happens when things happen like that. So the Finnish hero Clavaro is ultimately undone when he picks up a stranger in his sled and lays with this person. And she ultimately kills herself when they find out that they have the same parents, right? Even in the English Arthurian legends, King Arthur doesn't kill himself when he finds out that he laid with his half sister, right? And bears the child Mordred. And Mordred does end up destroying his kingdom and ending his life. And Arthur tries to have him abandoned on an island with a ship full of other babies. So there's that too. But this is pretty wild, right? Pretty gross, but pretty wild. So the next common occurrence, and I see we lost a couple of viewers from that point, and I apologize for that, but this has to be talked about. So the next point of interest that we see is the stealing of fire from the gods, something that multiple cultures talk about. And I know we keep going into the Greeks, but in Greek mythology, Prometheus gets sick with a human cold, and he steals fire and ends up getting chained to a rock forever while an eagle eats his liver, right? Well, he gets sick of how cold humans are, really. And they say it's the cold, but whatever. Meanwhile, in Native American culture, stories of coyotes or rabbits does the exact same thing with pretty much no consequences. So we see this as a prevalent story where mankind steals fire or is given fire from the gods under a circumstance of whether they stole it or it's given to them by not the collective of the gods, it's given to them by one god, and that one god is punished for doing so. We also see this in the Bible with the knowledge, right? The tree of life and the giving of knowledge. It's a representation. And when Eve eats that eats that apple and the serpent tells her to do so, they're cast out of Eden. Adam and Eve are cast out of Eden. But that was the serpent's motive, right? So there's similarities here, and we can go into the hermeneutics of it all and look at the wording and the way that the wording is matching as well. Paul Wallace is amazing for that, right? And actually, Paul Wallace will probably be coming on at the end of April to promote the Eden series. And um, if you haven't gotten wind of on the community tab that the Eden Conspiracy is available on Kindle for pre-order, I would suggest you get your hands on it because let me tell you, I have dove into a little bit of it and it is game changing. I do not say that lightly, right? It's game changing. This book is phenomenal. And I'm telling you, it's going to change a lot for a lot of people. And Paul is brilliant as always. I had the honor of being in the third book, being referenced in name and also in the acknowledgments. So I believe it's an honor and a privilege for that to have happened. And also, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to help promote for Paul because Paul is an amazing man who does amazing work. And we are friends, and I respect him. He is like a mentor to me, and I would help him in any way, shape, or form that he needed it at any time. So Go and get your copy as well. I'm going to put the link for it into the chat so you can see it because I'm telling you, it is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. But back to what we're talking about here. So there are many, many, many stories of the gods stealing fire, or no, the gods either giving fire or humans stealing fire, which is exceptional, right? Absolutely exceptional. So, as we keep going, huh, going to hell for a visit with pretty predictable results, right? There are many, many references to the underworld in many, many different cultures or the dark area, right? Which is, and it's really, really wild to understand how they went about putting all of this together and what was the representation that they saw as the other side that gave them the ability to say, hey, this is, this is pretty incredible. We're in the underworld, which that brings me a lot of questions, right? So before we dive into it, um here is the link to pre-order your copy of the Eden Conspiracy by Paul Wallace. Actually, I'm gonna have to shorten it, but that's okay because it's too long. Too long. I don't know. Maybe it'll work. Maybe it won't. Let me take off a couple. Well, let's see if that works. Probably not. Maybe. Oh yeah, it gets you there. It gets you there. Perfect. Perfect. That's a little bit of on the fly right there. See how we did that? But Paul Wallace is worth it. Get your copy pre-ordered today. So as we go through, we're with the Greeks again. Orpheus descends to Hades to retrieve his lover, Eurydice, only to lose her at the hands his last second before he goes back. The Mayans have a story about this, where a ball players, the Hunahapu and the Vakub Hanapu, piss off the lords of the dead and get challenged to play a ball match in the underworld, where the penalty for losing is basically death or their souls. The Sumerian goddess Ayana, which we're going to talk about at great length in a later episode, tries to visit her sister, Erishagal, in the underworld. And after stripping butt naked in order to make it down there to her sister's palace, she gets killed for the effort. And Orifice becomes immortal through his art. And the Hanupus brothers, father, they all have sons. This is basically where they all come back to life at some point or go to hell and come back, right? Which is seen all over the globe. This is a prominent result where the underworld or the other side or the dark realm is accessed and people come back, right? Again, we're not going to go into specifics, but we will do an episode probably based on this as well, because the stories themselves all come from one place, which is absolutely incredible. And I'm not sure if I believe that I think it's a common ancestor, and we're being handed, you know, this information. And again, it goes through that game of telephone, the cultural game of telephone, where people sort of critique it and hone it into their culture and make these stories relevant. But I think it was extraterrestrials that passed these stories down, and these stories actually weren't from this planet at all. They were from different planets and also the fifth, sixth, and seventh dimensions, where they could have been played out in an etherical plane or the seven heavens, right? Who knows? Who knows? But that's something we can look into as well. So, another one that we see is littering saves the day. You're going to be like, people who love the environment out there, I know. This isn't actual littering. But what this means is, basically someone is pissed off or pisses off a terrifying monster like a witch or a bear or a floating head, and they desperately try to get away, they throw a seemingly useless object behind them, like power ups in Mario Kart, and boom, they're good. They're out. Or they defeat the monster. David and Goliath, right? In the Iroquois, the legends, the hero will often throw a rock, which turns into an enormous mountain, which lands on whatever he's fighting. A little Russian girl fleeing from a witch, the Baba Yaga, which you see in front of you, throws a comb, which becomes a thick forest, a comb like a pine cone, right? In a German fairy tale, the master maid, right? And the maid turns a flask of water into the whole sea. And the moral of these stories is simple: littering is always bad unless you're being chased by, you know, something big or magical. So, but that's kind of a joke, but this is true, right? Like these instances all have that same sort of feel to it. And there's a lot of stories of this in every culture. Every culture. So as we keep going, you like the Mario Kart analogy? It was pretty funny too, yeah. I thought it was, but the gods take mortal form. This is sort of almost like a repeat. What if God was one of us? But this one's a little bit different, right? This is talking about the gods laying with women and creating the offspring, which are demigods and a new race of humankind. This happens all the time in every culture. We see this. The gods or the angels, the fallen angels, even in the Bible, mate with women or of earth and create demons or hellspawn, right? Sometimes it's seen as good or sometimes it's seen as bad, but it still is seen and it still happens. So in Greek mythology, Hercules strangles a bunch of snakes as a baby, then gets a little older and murders his wife and kids, but he is a demigod. Hindu mythology has a story about baby Krishna, an incarnation of Lord Vishnu, steals so much food from his neighbors that one of his permanent divine names becomes the butter thief. This escalates to a point where he threatens to kill his own mother when she tries to stop him. Some of the stories in the Christian tradition don't always make Jesus Christ look like great, According to the infancy gospel of Thomas, uh, you know, Jesus spent his youth alternately causing damage and hurting people and resurrecting them and his playmates, basically because he didn't understand who he was yet. So some of this is also what it's doing is it's humanizing these characters in mythology, showing you that they've gone through a process to be where they are, which is actually very compartmentalized if we look at it. Because if we apply this to the Great Awakening and meditation and manifestation, it's all trial and error to see what path works for us, the individual, to achieve those specific goals which we've set for ourselves in the spiritual community, right? So there's a lot of connection here. There's a lot of um, anticipation on my part to dive into this stuff, especially on a spiritual level, because examining this stuff spiritually will give us the ability to understand ourselves better, right? And that's the ultimate goal, truly the ultimate goal. And I mean, the next one I want to get to is the hero's journey, but I think we're going to stop here because we have creation, the hero's journey, and the twins or the brothers, which is a great segue for the next episode, the part 2 of this, and breaking down the hero's journey and what that means, right? So, this information is also, when we look at if these gods might be mortal, could be a clear indication of extraterrestrial life. These entities with this vast technology, come to Earth, and they're either fifth density, sixth density, seventh density, but they downgrade themselves to become 3D physical to interact with mankind, to teach mankind, to show mankind the way. We have stories of that too. We can find them, right? And we might even one of the things I want to do is I want to create timelines for specific gods and goddesses so we can see their path from ancient Sumeria all the way up to, the dark ages and things like that. But maybe even to today if we can get that far, right? So there's a lot of stories that we're going to dive into and really like break down each line of the story. And we're going to connect it to other cultural references of the same thing, right? Or these same motifs or themes, and break down the exact stories. And I've been diving into this stuff, so I'm going to have more specifically detailed presentations. But for an overview, this was a great beginning, and this is, like I said, something we're going to shift this show to sort of incorporate more of the historical references into that spiritual journey. And I think that we've done a lot of work in refining our spiritual selves, our energetic selves. Now it's time to put that into practice with this ancient information and create the connection, because it's an understanding of this planet. It's an understanding of us. It's an understanding of what the entities that embolden us tried to do at an earlier time, or it's basically understanding the cycles before this cycle. And it's also a way to understand where we've come from. And we always say this all the time: man or a woman who doesn't know where it comes from is a man or a woman lost, right? To understand the ancestors is to understand who you are and the journey they took to get to us, right? And there's so many different aspects of these stories that we can call into conflict with a lot of modern historians, and they try to, you know, segregate these things and compartmentalize it so we don't see the full picture. So going through that as well, it's going to be great. And to understand our history is to understand our future as well, because history repeats itself. It's all cyclistic. So what we're really doing is we're diving into the history books to predict our future and to know the paths in which our future could potentially take. There's so many different aspects that we can use this information for. Right? And again, we're going to touch on all new topics, right? We did the spiritual thing for a while, and we're still going to do it now and again. We're going to incorporate history. We're going to incorporate politics. We're going to incorporate culture. We're going to incorporate the ancestors. I mean, we're really going to reinvent ourselves here. And I'm so excited for this because I feel like there'll be something for everybody to go even further. And that's what we're trying to do. If we do the same thing for too long, we become stagnant. And I don't want to just stay in one area. I want this show and these presentations to be multifaceted. I want to be able to touch on anything and everything. And sometimes we get into these modes where we start to really, dive into one specific topic. I want to spice it up a little bit more. I think it'll do well to help get the channel further out as well, to create and grow this community even more. Because as you can see, talking about the empowerment of spiritual empowerment has done a lot for the people who listen to this channel. And I love that. But it's done a detriment to the reach of this channel for some reason. They don't want us to do this. So what we're doing is we're still going to do it in the context of something just a little slightly different, because we're going to beat the censorship, but we're not going to capitulate to it, right? So we're going to keep doing that. And that's why I ask everybody, please like, subscribe, share, leave that comment, right? And don't forget, tonight after this, Omar is going on with Augie. They're going to do their show where they're reading from the spiritual science book that Augie has, which I have right here. Oh, it's upside down. Want everybody to be able to see it. Can't see it because of the virtual background, but there we go. Perfect. There it is. There it is. This book is life changing, right? This book is life changing, and I want to be able to give different perspectives, and put like what we've been saying into practice as well. You know, and exactly, Nicole, exactly. I like to learn as much as I can as well. So going into these different aspects of history is a great way to feel out different experiences. So we're going to do a part two to this where we talk about creation, the hero's journey. The flood myth took us a while to get through because it's that important, right? So, with all that being said, I love you all so much. I hope this all found you with love and abundance. I'm here for everybody. If you need me, you all know how to reach out. Um, we're putting together another healing workshop very, very shortly. We're also putting together a workshop that is a history based workshop. When that's ready, that'll be the history based workshop will be free. The next healing workshop will be another paid event, which is going to absolutely blow your minds. The research is coming in fast and furious, and I'm discerning and disseminating info as we speak. So it's going to be, it's going to be absolutely incredible when we get to it as well. So, with all that being said, my name is Rob Yox. Please like, share, subscribe, leave a comment when the stream is finished. I love you all, and I'll see you all next time. Have a great night.